Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter. And today I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Stephen Dansiger. Hi, Steve. How are you?
Hey, Jane. How are you today?
I'm very good. A bit hoarse and scratchy, but pretty good. So, Steve, it's really great. You're in the States. I think it's early there, is it?
Early enough, but it's workday early. It's 9 a.m.
Okay, fair enough. Well, thank you for taking the time to begin your day with me. To start, can you just tell me a bit about yourself, Steve, please?
Sure. So I was born here in the States in Brooklyn, New York, and raised on Long Island, which is the suburbs of New York City. And when I was 16, I left for college, actually. And at the same time I left for college, I started playing the punk rock clubs of New York City. This is late 70s. I know, it was bad timing or good timing, something. And went on to develop a pretty bad addiction problem in my first 2 years of college there, whilst playing club dates all the time. And so I sort of fast forward to that because it is important in as much as I was kicked out or left the university through the university hospital at the beginning of my third year. And I went on to continue my music career. So I was a punk rock drummer essentially from the late 70s into the mid 80s. Actually all the way to the end of the 80s. And then what happened was I found recovery in 12-step programs and simultaneously found Zen meditation. Through 12-step programs where I was brought on a 12-step retreat at a Zen monastery.
Nice.
And so I've been going to 12-step programs ever since, 33 years now. And I've been sitting meditation in that way for 33 years. So where that led then was I became a high school English teacher. I then became a punk rock drummer again, professionally. I then became a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice educator for 10 years. And then when I moved here to Los Angeles, I met a whole bunch of my friends from New York who had moved here, who had become therapists. And they were all, started pulling me in.
Had you known them from college or from the punk rock scene, or a mix of backgrounds?
Like a mix. Punk rock scene, 12-step scene, college scene, a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually, it's funny, you just sort of triggered this little memory. In all three of those venues, I had a nickname, Stevie D.
Okay.
In a long time. But yeah, it was all the folks who knew me as Stevie D were like, you should be a therapist, Stevie D. And so,
that's so funny.
And my therapist back in New York too was very encouraging of this idea too. He said, you would be good at this. And I resisted for a long time just because I had some idea of what it was that I found out actually it isn't that. And so went on to go to school, get a master's and a doctorate, and started working primarily in addiction treatment settings. And I'd never wanted to, and it's just sort of what happened. And then in one addiction treatment setting that I was in, I was working with a young person, helping him with his work in mindfulness and other recovery capital. And he was getting EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And the clinical director, who was my supervisor, she was my first supervisor, she was using it as a frontline therapy. And this is 2005, that was not common yet. And I watched as she brought in some consultation from one of the original people around the EMDR community in the late 80s. I watched this young person start to get better. And I said, train me in this, please. And the consultant was running a training that next month, and I got trained in EMDR therapy, and I never looked back. And his whole thing at the same time, 2005, not at the forefront of people's consciousness, was EMDR therapy is a complete psychotherapy. You can use it for everything, and everything else fits well into it. And so that's how I've practiced since then. So I describe myself at this point, I don't know if in 25 words or less, because I do live near Hollywood here, is essentially where I kind of landed after all these years is, Buddhist psychology and mindfulness practice really informs everything that I do. I've taken essentially a bodhisattva vow to wake up in the morning and think, how can I heal suffering?
Right.
And I do that through working with people directly with EMDR therapy, also training EMDR therapists. I'm training EMDR therapists all over the world, especially these days in Northern Ireland and Ireland, which is great news for all of us. And I have a drum kit sitting over there. I'll still sit there.
Out a few.
Yeah, exactly. In between sessions. Yeah.
Or healing, probably. Yeah. And I speaking of drumming, I remember reading or hearing, I can't remember which, Bessel van der Kolk and Bruce Perry both mentioned that drumming is actually so good for right and left brain integration, that it is actually very good for the nervous system and everything. Did you know that when you started, or would you even agree?
I 100,000 billion% agree, if that's a number. 100% agree. And I 100% agree. And I know that was my experience. And I think there was an intuition. I remember when I was 8 years old and my parents said, all right, I was the firstborn. So they were like, okay, they tell us you're supposed to have them play an instrument, so what instrument do you want to play? I was like, the drums. They're like, I don't know, try, what's your second choice? Like, they're like, violin. But fortunately for me, the way I see it now, and for them at the time, I was brought to a little music school where they didn't let me touch a drum. They didn't let me touch a drum kit. They had me on a practice pad, so it wasn't noisy. And I spent like the first 2 years doing slow bilateral.
Oh, right.
Practicing like this. And if you know anything about EMDR therapy, when we're doing resourcing, we're trying to build resilience and build resources for a person. That's the speed of bilateral that we use, right? And so bilateral is in all kinds of things, and particularly in drumming. And then if you think of models of indigenous healing and how much drumming is implicated or used in throughout indigenous cultures of millennia past, then you really start to intuit it more. And then I remember too, I don't know if I was giving myself EMDR therapy when I was a punk rock drummer, but what does he want? And I don't know how healing or not healing that was. It certainly was good exercise. And then also, late 70s, early 80s, the punk rock scene and the lyrics of, the great punk rock songs and the energy of the social justice bent of it, really all of that put together, healed me. So anyway, yes, I'm very much on board with the power of drumming. Okay.
Well, just before I get into some of the questions as well that I had planned for you, what do you think your friends and your therapists in New York saw in you that they thought, wow, Stevie D, you should consider becoming a therapist?
So my therapist in New York, who is a wonderful character and just a beautiful human being, and very old school. He chain smoked through our sessions, like so let's start there. And in terms of, it was a little different, but he was always noting, and we noted together. He was someone who taught me through experientially that I am the expert on me, that the client kind of leads the dance, and we heal ourselves with this assistance through this relationship and through the modalities and such. And I guess he just saw that I had a way of doing that for myself that would translate well to facilitate for others. I think was part of it. And then he also, this is how he got me, was he said, this is a very creative profession. And my whole thing at that time was creative profession equals I am in a club playing drums, and a working artist, like that. And that was some of my resistance. I'm like, no, I'm not giving up the fight, or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
And so then I noticed, I was like, man, that's pretty creative the way he got me from where I was 5 years ago to where I am now.
Yeah, right.
And then when I got here, it was all my friends from my creative communities and and they're all like, come on, it's creative.
Join
like
the
your
club.
therapist said, join the club. We're healing suffering and we're doing it creatively. And so the thing that really got me then too was the very first thing I did before I was a therapist was I ran anger management groups at an addiction treatment center. And as soon as I was faced with the task, I was like, what's the creative, what's the solution to this? Or how do I work with what I know to bring it to bear in here? And I pretty quickly came up with like 2-3 core exercises that are still what I do today and what I put in my Mindfulness for Anger Management book. And that showed me, through the experience, the on-the-job training, that it's really creative.
Yeah, very good. So as a therapist then, can you talk to me a bit about why you think attachment and the quality of our attachment relationship as a small child, a baby, is significant in terms of maybe our capacity to form safe, healthy relationships as adults? Or is our attachment experience important, Steve?
Sure. A lot of what's gone on from my observation in the therapy world has mostly been great in the last like 30, 40 years in terms of our moving towards an understanding of things like, the body keeps the score, and attachment in early life plays a huge part, and that trauma and adverse life events play a huge role in what happens along the way that brings what we call, symptoms, diagnoses, dilemmas, and difficulties, right? And that at a lot of times, though, folks start to like land on a particular lane in the highway and be like, this is it, right? So I come from a place, attachment is very, very important. I don't land in it is the be all and end all school. And I believe, though, that when you look at it holistically from this place of what is the result of attachment rupture, what is the result of attachment, disillusion, is trauma, right? And so come from a trauma-focused sort of prism and lens in order to look at the attachment and what happened with the attachment, and then how to repair the attachment or to treat the attachment wounds from the scope of the whole of the person's lifespan. So it's it's not getting caught, and again, this is not a be all and end all statement either. Not getting caught in the past, getting caught in the early childhood as the be all and end all, because what I've seen is that many clients find themselves staying caught there.
Right. They can't move on.
Can't
don't believe they can move on.
Yes. And so there needs to be a combination of, getting back in there to treat it. And that's why I love Emdr, and I love the different Buddhist psychology and Buddhist mindfulness, because there's a sort of the use of detachment in order to treat attachment. Right.
Okay.
And that there's this, that being the observer, the way we are in mindfulness practice, does not exacerbate attachment wounds. It allows us to observe the attachment and the attachment wounds, and then observe what the pathways might be, in collaboration with a therapist in this case, what the pathway for my attachment wounds would be. And it's, interesting too, for myself. When I was born blue. I almost didn't make it.
Oh, wow.
And, my mom, this is 1962. And not to say that there aren't, difficult labors, difficult births today, but I think the story I was told was that there wasn't a good handover, like warm handoff in her extremely long labor. Okay. And so the docs who were working on delivering me after like 14 hours didn't know that there had been 14 hours that had passed. And anyway, I was wrapped in the umbilical cord, and so it was an emergency cesarean at the end. And my mom got an infection, and she almost passed. Like she was in rough shape for, she stayed in the hospital.
Mm.
And I stayed in a not in a NICU or anything, but in a nursery.
Incubating thing? Okay.
No, just in a nursery, right?
Yeah.
So waiting for mom to be able to
Yeah.
take me home. And then a baby got sick in that nursery.
Oh,
And
gosh.
so it got quarantined. And so they started shipping people out and not putting new babies in. So I spent a lot of my first 10 days of life in a huge nursery by myself, with it, right? So,
a stressful start, a stressful, highly stressful, traumatic way into the world, and a tough first 10 days for sure.
And unable to attach to my mom physically for that period of time. And then my mom had like postpartum symptoms and had a hard time forming attachment. So anyway, me and my therapist, we worked it out. But the whole point being that I have some like visceral knowledge of, I think, what that feels like, which is, that 10 days and that, first year where she was still recovering and all that kind of stuff had an impact, definitely had an impact. Yeah. I can see it when I look at, my past and the chronology and sort of the different kinds of work that I had to do. So I think and then in the end, one of the things that makes us uniquely human is our more mammalian side of having these attachment behaviors, that are like an upgrade to, just having, reptilian sort of like, oh, it's hot on my back, I'm going to go under that rock now without thinking words, right? And so attachment and relational, getting to see that too in vivo during the pandemic, the fact that, this is great because I never would have met you possibly, right? And at the same time, this two-dimensional lifestyle is, it's different.
It is, and we don't get you get a certain element of the person's energy, but it's not quite the same as being in the room with them. But still, thank goodness for it. How would we have coped at all without it?
My goodness. I've been embedded in this community I've been doing a master's in healthcare innovation, and I just have been able to witness so many ways that, I'm not going to call it silver linings or thank goodness for the pandemic, but just to see it from this perspective of, when there's crisis, there's potential for innovation, and people have stepped up and then are finding each other this way and being able to work together this way and being able to heal people this way.
And lots of people have done therapy online as well. And I believe for some, it actually works better maybe than doing it in person. So, I suppose to each his or her own as well in all of this. Steve, what is your view on the adverse childhood experience science or framework? Is it useful?
100%, yes. I guess I'm going a lot with 100% today. But
we might plummet later.
We'll see how it goes. We'll find a question. But oh my goodness. So that's where I feel like you get a more robust picture. The social determinants of health and how they're impacted and how they impact, early childhood, and then what the numbers say. Start with what the numbers say about what it does to folks to have even just one of the ACEs that triggers you now are in this group. And it depends on the study you look at, but there's plenty of studies that use numbers like 90% of people who show up to inpatient mental health centers have one or more or two or more adverse childhood events. And then the thing that really helps me with that is I work a lot, along this continuum. And this continuum is, big T trauma to traffic on the 405 freeway here in LA, right? And that everything, this goes back to the Buddhist psychology, where, there's this the Four Noble Truths, the initial teaching of the historical Buddha, where it's, so the first truth is life is suffering, right? Which often has a lot of people just turn away from Buddhist practice because it's
That's
like,
not too
that's
happy.
a bummer. Let's, you got anything else? But the translation of the word for suffering, dukkha, actually has another translation, which is unsatisfactoriness.
Nice.
Right. So the continuum, right? There's old age, sickness, and death, and systemic oppression and racism, and then there's the traffic on the 405. Or this morning, my kid was like, "I do not want to go to school." I'm like, "Yeah."
Oh, you've one of those too.
Oh yeah. She was embedded in the bed. It was like, and how, like, how does this end? What happens now? And what happens now could be, it could be a nuclear explosion, and I disown her, and like, right, or somewhere in the middle, or it could be, okay, honey, we'll work it out. Would you like some breakfast? And so that's life. Yeah. Right. Life is, and then what causes this unsatisfactoriness? What causes this? The suffering is not the pain of life itself, but rather my response to it, my reaction to it. So that's the second truth, is that the symptoms, the causes are craving, clinging, aversion, right? And so, that's where I start to make my connections between trauma therapy and Buddha, is essentially fight or flight, survival mechanisms, like doing what they're supposed to do, but maybe doing them a little bit too much, right? And then the third truth is there actually is a cure for suffering. And the cure is not like ending the pain of life, not possible, but I can end craving, clinging, aversion, etc. And so then the fourth truth is the prescription. This is a diagnostic, by the way, also. That's the other thing I love about it. It's like the diagnosis, suffering and unsatisfactoriness, the symptoms and causes, craving, clinging, aversion, unhealthy attachment. The cure is the ending this, and then the prescription is the eightfold path that the Buddha described, which says build wisdom, set intention from this wisdom, and then speak, act, and work in the world, and then make an effort to get mindfulness and concentration. And I bring this all up to say, in reference to the ACEs and the ACEs studies, is that, the ACEs studies sort of give me that very real world, I can see it with my own eyes, hear it with my own ears, view of big T trauma, suffering, and its effects, and how it, of course, it makes people crave and cling, crave something else, cling to, whatever it is that is safe or safe enough. Be averse to systemic oppression, all of this makes sense. But then how do I not have that turn into a tsunami of craving, clinging, aversion, craving, clinging, aversion? How does that not turn into addictions and, and difficulties in life of all the various kinds, mental health, emotional health, physical health, spiritual health. And so the other thing around the ACEs is that I also understand that someone with the traffic on the 405 level of difficulty in life could develop all those same symptoms and behaviors and such. So when people come into my office, I'm not putting them on some hierarchy. I'm going into the spirit of curiosity of what happened. That you're not inherently, it's not about focusing on pathology and something inherently wrong in the person, because that's just not the way it is. It's the effect of the ACEs and other traumas and adverse life events that started an internal, sort of adaptation in order to survive or to move through these situations. And then eventually, when they're not the best, like when they're not skillful, they're not healthy, they tend to snowball and become, the list of difficulties that someone comes in And so what I want to do is to be able to identify, their particular history of ACEs and non-ACEs, and then start to work through them with them.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've not had this discussion or anything like it really around the Buddha and the craving, clinging, aversion, but I can certainly see from from my reading and other conversations that even say emotional avoidance or detachment, aversion to people or aversion to close relationships, maybe because of emotional abuse or neglect or whatever, how it could manifest as that, and that might be your key kind of symptom or whatever. So it's terribly interesting. Can we talk a bit now about the finer details, maybe, or what EMDR actually is and how it works? Like you referred to resources earlier. So kind of for someone who doesn't know a thing about it, basically, I know a little bit, but pitch it at the level of someone who knows absolutely nothing. Steve,
sure.
please.
And I'll try not to get too far in the weeds, because I spend so much time training new therapists in it.
Yeah.
I've been told sometimes I eventually go in the weeds. So I'll try and keep it, at the high level, in as much as Francine Shapiro, who passed away about 3 years ago now, she was a psychologist who had a cancer diagnosis of her own. And so she went on a mind, body, spirit search to see what might be helpful. And I'm leading with this because it's only a recent part of the story for everyone who knows EMDR therapy, is that she got some mindfulness training from Stephen Levine, who's a Buddhist teacher back in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, etc. And he also was close with Kubler-Ross and involved in the death and dying and grieving therapy movement. In any case, what happened was, one of the things that happened for her was she was walking through the park one day and she noticed that she had some bad thoughts about her cancer. And then she noticed that her eyes were kind of tracking rapidly, the way you might when you're walking along and sort of noticing the landscape. And she just noticed that it was kind of rapid, more rapid than one would think. Mm-hmm. And the reason I brought up the mindfulness first is because the way I see it, if she hadn't had a mindfulness practice, she wouldn't have noticed this.
Right. Wow. Okay. She'd been too busy or too panicked or something.
Thinking her crappy thoughts about stuff. And so she's like, this is interesting. I'm just going to notice that. And then when they died down or she got bored with them or whatever it was, she checked in with this thought about her cancer and it was like not charged anymore. She's like, that's weird. So she's like, let me try it again on purpose, right? And so she thought of something awful and then moved her eyes back and forth really fast. And afterwards, she's like, feels all right. Went home. She had like this guest house relationship, I believe, with AJ Popky, who turned out to be the first EMDR therapist to bring it into the world of addictions and also with veterans. And she's like, can I try something on you? And AJ also passed away this year. And he was the perfect person for this. He's that person who would basically, in his life, I went to his service. He did everything. Right? Okay. So he was the perfect, like, can I try this? Oh, sure. Yeah. What do you want me to do? And she's like, follow my fingers and move your eyes back and forth while you're thinking of something awful. Okay, Francine, I trust you.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. That's what we're doing today. And she's like, what do you notice? And he's like, yeah, it doesn't feel quite as charged. And literally that's how it began, right? So then she went into her sort of therapist workshop and put together what I consider to be sort of greatest hits of Eastern, Western, and Indigenous psychology around it and through it in order to create a protocol that would perhaps do what it did in those brief moments, which was to desensitize. Okay. Right? So she first published it as eye movement desensitization. And her first study was published with a cohort that was Vietnam War vets and sexual assault survivors. Okay. Because her thought was, if it works for that level of PTSD, then it'll possibly work for other things, as opposed to the reverse. And it was great, outcomes, and it bore out over time. So she was kind of in the literature as eye movement desensitization when someone who was had a sight impairment came in for treatment, and she's like, uh-oh. And so she just instinctively tapped on their knees at the same cadence, and it worked.
Wow.
So ever since then, it's tactile, it's audio tones, and it's also eye movements. And then the other thing that happened early on was she noticed that something more than just, like a Valium without the side effects was happening, that it wasn't just desensitization, that there was brain change going on, and that there was this complete reprocessing of the memory to the point where the person was now feeling, like as if they have lost their PTSD diagnosis, right? And that they are now in wellness. And so she changed the name to EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
So can I just ask, with that part, some of the descriptions about trauma are that it might have happened long ago in the past, but you still kind of feel like you're living it in the present, or you can be hijacked at any moment by sounds or smells or whatever. So am I right in thinking that the reprocessing part helps the people realize that it truly is past? It's no longer, they're not going through it anymore. Is that an aspect of it, Steve?
Yes, that's actually a great brief description of the end result, as it were. And the way that I describe the end result also to trainees and to clients who I'm giving psychoeducation about it is just as an example, right? There's a number of different proposed or posited mechanisms of action. One which includes REM sleep, that it's mimicking REM sleep. But one of the examples I like to use is the orienting response, that it's mimicking the orienting response, right? That we're, like she was in the park and checking for danger, see if there's a lion or a tiger around, right? And when, let's say I'm a deer in the forest as opposed to a person, 98 times out of 100, when I hear something and I look up, right, to make sure I'm okay, it's the wind through the trees, boring, right? Then I'm gonna munch on grass again. Then one time out of 100, it's, oh, that's a very attractive deer, like the go towards excitement response. And then there's one time out of the 100 where it's a bear, right? So I run away and I get away, let's say, and I'm not on my couch 5 years later talking about the bear incident. I'm not at the bar later that day talking about the bear. I go, it's about an hour for all of it to complete, the cortisol and the adrenaline and all of that. And you might even see
the tremor response.
The tremor response. And then when the deer is, done, it's like, we're munching on grass, and we're not looking up 102 times an hour. We're still just looking up 100 times an hour, as it were. And so the problem with us people is that we do, we have good news, bad news. We have the neocortex, we have the insight mind. It can get involved in a way, and or the system can block it from ever getting to the neocortex. But the neocortex can go, whoa, that really sucked. I am never going to think about that again. And that's impossible. It's going to go somewhere, right? So it goes into the parts of the memory system that are not built for long-term storage, that don't get into meaning making and narratives and chronology and all that. Or it could be, that was really awful, I better be looking for that everywhere all the time, right? The hyper-vigilance, which is the same deal, right? It's, we're on guard. And so one of the positive mechanisms of action is that the eye movements, is the 98 times out of 100 where there's no threat. And you're bringing up this threat, and then eventually through the protocol, it gets to this part where it's no threat. And if it basically essentially is, oh yeah, that happened and it's not happening now. Whereas before, it was living in the eternal present, the way things do in the amygdala, and in that part of the brain, which is in the eternal present, looking for threats and assessing threat or no threat. That is not there's no timestamp. It's not, that part of the brain and part of the experience is not, there's no timestamp. There's no narrative. There's no there's no processing through to the insight mind, right? So a lot of folks, when they get to the end of an EMDR session, and we're both lucky here, I actually went through a 4-hour EMDR intensive for myself on Saturday. So this is fresh. Okay. And I had this experience of that I hear from a lot of my clients, which is, yeah, it's like, you know, at the beginning of the session, it's like 10 out of 10 distressing, and it's happening right now. And at the end of the session, it's like a black and white picture. It's about 5 feet away. I see that it's me, and it's okay. Right? Phenomenal.
Yeah, phenomenal for people who are overwhelmed frequently by the intense feelings surrounding it. And can you tell me, Steve, is it a talk therapy, or is it more of a silent therapy where people think about the idea and then are tapped or follow the finger, or is it a combination?
So you've mentioned Dr. Van der Kolk a few times, and one of the things that he talks about in The Body Keeps the Score is the different ways that we can treat trauma. And there are 3 pathways, and one pathway is top down, which is you know, talk and relational and insight into self. And then there's what he calls technologies, right? And technologies are, you know, medications that shut down inappropriate alarm reactions, and protocols like EMDR that change the way the brain organizes information. And then there's bottom up, where you have like the work of Peter Levine and others, where the focus is deeply on having like these deep visceral experiences that shift the body and the mind's then ability to understand that we're safe right now, right here, and to have that contradict these experiences contradict the helplessness, the rage, the horror, and all that. And so EMDR therapy is all 3.
Okay.
That's why I love it. And then also to your point about, you know, silence, you know, in when I got trained in EMDR therapy, if you were in an EMDR therapy session, fly on the wall style, and you were to hear what the therapist was saying, on certain sessions, I say almost nothing during the reprocessing, except for take a breath.
Yeah.
What are you noticing? Notice that.
Yeah.
Right?
So like, the mindfulness side of things comes in.
Yes. And we're leveraging this, you know, and that was the other thing that tipped me and others off to Shapiro having had a mindfulness background, was this language of what are you noticing now? Notice that. Not what are you feeling, what are you thinking, what's happening in your body, but what are you noticing? Meaning, it can be coming from anywhere, be anything. And so it's a big reason why our team that trains in EMDR therapy, we are very clear about giving people mindfulness training for symptom reduction, you know, for them to do better and have more resilience and have more tools before they even get into reprocessing, but then they become really good at reprocessing. Right, because it is a mindfulness exercise. It is, you know, when they're reporting something, what are you noticing now? They tell me what's happening now, because the last report, that's so 45 seconds ago, right? That this is moving along and new linkages are happening. Things, associative memory networks. One of the things that Shapiro talks about is that the best clinical tool I have is the associative memory networks of the person in front of me. So me going blah, 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 and interpreting and, you know, getting on, not as helpful as facilitating their own intrinsic trauma healing, their own intrinsic, like the same way when my kid, she still gets owies, right? Because she doesn't call them owies, but now she's a volleyball player. So her knees are taking punishment, right? And so let's say she scrapes her knee. What am I going to do, right? I'm going to kiss it. I'm going to, you know, whatever, you know, I don't know if that's good or bad. I just know that, you know, that's what we do, right? Parents. So I kiss it and then I clean it. Then I start to get smart. I clean it. I cover it. Eventually I uncover it because it needs air. And then it scabs maybe, and then maybe it scars, maybe it doesn't. I didn't do anything, right? I facilitated the natural process of healing that her body knows how to do. Same with the mind, same with the psyche, same with, you know, all of this is that I'm the reason why there's so much silence, the reason why it's all about the client and their experience and teaching them how to notice is because that's who's doing the healing. that's who's doing the work. So
yeah, so interesting indeed. And I think people don't maybe realize that about themselves, that they've everything they already need inside themselves. They just need someone to guide them through it,
yes.
which is so interesting. So Steve, we have mentioned Bessel a few times. I did a training with them in Cork a few years back, and I think it was at that he said that the therapeutic relationship is the key change agent, but especially where the therapist can help the person with affect regulation. Do you think in general, in the clinical mental health setting, is the relationship between, say, the psychiatrist or the psychologist as well understood and as elevated as it should be? I think it is well understood in psychotherapy, but do the other mental health professionals maybe get it enough?
Yeah, we, definitely therapists and docs and others, get different training, right? And the focus for us psychotherapists, when I remember when I was in school and every study would come back and say the relationship is the biggest part. The relationship is the biggest part. And then you have the folks who resonated with me, like, Carl Rogers and such, that, talked about and presented this idea of client-centered care and of the primacy of the relationship and how healing that is. And, going back to your question about attachment, right? I mean, just that, the attachment repair and healing that comes through that relationship. So I definitely believe, and this is part, I guess, of my mission of the last few years, is that if everyone who's involved in mental health, emotional health, care, change, doesn't have some sense of the importance of relationship and the importance of having a trauma-informed approach to relationship, that we're gonna hamster wheel it for another few decades or something.
Right. Okay.
And one of the things that I love about Bessel van der Kolk's work is around this, like, as he has had his own journey and discovered, he's like, oh wait, yoga, and and kind of keeps moving along this, now he's doing a lot with the psychedelic therapy, and seeing how it all gets put together. In the midst of it all, like I went to a talk of his just before the pandemic started, and he said some of the things that I've heard him say before that make my life easier to do. For instance, he has said in the past, and says it like still 30 years later, every clinician should get trained in EMDR therapy, whether they're going to use it or not. Right. There's this deep foundation there. And then he also talked about the importance of the relationship in the psychedelic or therapy, right? That like, please folks, don't see all these different things as panaceas or these technologies as same with EMDR therapy. Like in the beginning of EMDR therapy, it had a reputation, like cold clinical exercise robot, 8-phase protocol, right? And the fact is that the first 2 phases of EMDR therapy are deeply, deeply relational, so that, like, there's this creation of resources, including relational resources, that then allows for us to have this weird engagement of what are you noticing now? Notice that, right? And have that still feel like, contained, protected, relatable, relational, all of that. So, my mission these days has been just confining it for the moment to who you're talking about, like all the treating stakeholders in the mental health community, that everybody needs to have that training, right? It has this reputation, it's the soft skills or something like that, right? And it's not, EMDR therapy doesn't work, for instance, without the relationship.
Yeah, I imagine not. I'm just thinking as a vulnerable person or someone who's so highly distressed, why would you go to, you're taking a huge leap of faith and trust.
Yes.
So to feel safe enough to do this kind of newfangled therapy in their own mind, having maybe tried so many more, then there has to be something, I would imagine, there between the therapist and the person.
And that's why one of the things that's very important, and I'll just focus on EMDR therapy, is the psychoeducation part, which is designed to help the client to understand that they are the expert on themselves, and you want them to be a collaborator. You don't want them to, you want to break that hierarchy perception.
Mm.
Some cases it's not a perception, right? But, there are treaters who will create that hierarchy very intentionally. But to come from this place that allows for us to collaborate, because that's what we're doing. And that takes relationship and building of trust. And one other thing on that sort of attachment and all the rest of it is how much busting of trust creates so many of the problems. And I'm pretty good at what I do. I'm pretty likable. I have this face that my mom gave me. My mom had that face. My mom's face, like people, she was not a therapist. Like people would just come up to her and go, "I have problems," and she'd be like, "Okay, let me listen." And so I have all these, I have all this at hand, but at the same time, I just completely lost my train of thought. So
that's okay. My raucous laughter at your mother's face. That
that was it. I just saw my mother's face. She's been gone for 10 years. So I was like, "Hi, Mom." Sorry about that.
Well, not to worry. Anyway, on trauma training, do you think other people should have it too? For example, social workers, teachers, early years professionals, judges, lawyers, and lots of other people in between, Steve.
So expanding the mission, as it were. So what happened for me was 2014 or so, I was ready to leave the field, or at least the field of addiction treatment, because I was just burned out. I was burned out, and I didn't see the point. Sorry about all the air quotes, but anyway, I got offered the opportunity to start a Buddhist treatment center. I was like, okay, haven't done that, and that's my wheelhouse. Yeah. And so I started to do that. And early on, I was like, well, okay, focusing on mindfulness and Dharma, this is great. EMDR therapy is really powerful and it's underutilized. What would happen if you made it the central therapy? You have 12-step places, you have medical places. Why not an EMDR therapy place with Buddhism? And so I went to the owner and he said, "I trust you, give it a shot." And so I started to do it wasn't really on the fly, it was intentional. I trained all the clinicians in EMDR therapy and started developing trauma-focused training for everyone else, from C-suite to, if it's a residential center, people cutting the grass, cooking the food, everybody, so that everyone gets some training in what it means to be trauma-informed and really, with EMDR therapy, trauma-focused. And that's something that myself and my co-author, Jamie Marich, we've written like 4 books together now, and 2 of them on EMDR therapy, one EMDR therapy and mindfulness, and the other healing addiction. And in all of this, all those books and everything else that we do, we have that, that focus. A big part of our work, my work with Jamie Marich, has been to make this move from trauma-informed to trauma-focused care. Because trauma-informed is great. It gives everybody an educational framework for how to do their work. Trauma-focused care implies we're going to treat the trauma. It's kind of like, I love the possibility that I might be a thought leader someday, but I'm actually a lot more excited about being an action leader, like that this should be made manifest. So from 2015 to 2018, I incubated this mindfulness and EMDR treatment template for addictions in 2 addictions treatment centers, the Buddhist Center and a 12-step center that asked me to do it. So that was a really good opportunity to see if the credits transferred, as it were. And it went very well. And so I rolled it out and changed the name to the Mindfulness and EMDR treatment template for agencies, because all sorts of folks were saying, you know what, we need this in the general mental health agency. And then the more that I sort of looked at it, it's like, oh my goodness, all kinds of institutions, government agencies, everybody needs, to do some form of this. And that if we don't change systems, we're not gonna change systems. We're not gonna have the same kind of results. And, in looking at the world right now, where we've been in a collective global trauma for over 2 years now, and it's not ending. And I've been saying for the last couple of years, and then whenever it ends, whatever that means, there's a tsunami of PTSD, that will start 6 months after, beyond what we already have, right? And so how do we help everyone to be able to do this? So just to that point, a lot of the work that my team is doing now, for instance, here in the States, we're working with the California Rural Indian Health Board, where we work with tribal clinics throughout California. We're working with the Asian Mental Health Collaborative, working with Asian American therapists to be able to treat, the results and the trauma of Asian hate that has happened here over the last couple of years. In Northern Ireland and in the Republic, we're doing work with therapists who are working with folks who have been directly impacted by the Troubles. Okay. And then we're moving on also to do more work with folks with addiction and general mental health problems throughout the island. And then I had the good fortune of somehow landing in the connected healthcare cluster and incubator at the Dundalk Institute of Technology. Okay. We moved in February 1st. And so for the next 3 years, we're going to be, having our work go through, have that be a hub of all the work we do, which also includes, I haven't even touched on it. I'm looking at the time, right? I've also, I'm the guy who has a VCR and a coffee maker, both blinking on 12 o'clock. But I've been working in the technology industry for like 10 years now. And so we've developed some technology in order to help people with these mental health outcomes. Point being, I also, when I was a DEIJ trainer, I developed a juvenile diversion program for young people who had committed hate crimes in New York City. This is back in the 90s. And the folks who had me do that have asked me to do it again. And so we're building it out, based on this idea that, for instance, one of the groups that I'm going to work with are the hate incident response teams at one of the local, it's a civil rights organization at their, to work with them to be able to do the trauma-informed care. I have a friend, a colleague, he's a friend, he's a dad friend, who I guess he can become a colleague. Yeah, you know how, because like everyone I have in my world was introduced through my daughter's friends, essentially at this point. But he is worked for years with counterterrorism with Los Angeles Police Department, and now is training people internationally. And he's developed this model where the social workers are in the middle of it, and prevention is at the middle of it. So this trauma-informed thinking, trauma-focused action. Folks need to be trained and have the language and have at least enough buy-in for it to really work. Otherwise, clinicians like myself are kind of like islands.
Yeah, I agree with that very much, that I think we all have a role to play, even if we're not trauma-focused practitioners or trauma-specific therapists of some kind. But just one more question on EMDR and the kind of mindfulness. Can anyone become trained in them and practice in them, or do you have to be a psychotherapist? So for example, could teachers or could a school social worker or police get training in it, or would that be inappropriate?
So EMDR therapy itself is a psychotherapy. Okay. And so the bottom line is we're looking for, and I know, in the States and in other countries, different regulations, ethical and legal regulations. Here in the States, we ask folks to have a master's or above level counseling degree or be in a master's level counseling degree, and or but medical professionals like nurses and docs and such, if they have a certain number of credits in counseling specifically, they can do the training. And so this is an ongoing discussion in the EMDR therapy community, both here and in Europe, where there's kind of two entities that sort of operate. But here, there's been a long discussion about what a paraprofessional version of EMDR therapy would look like. But the last thing I'll say about that is it is a psychotherapy that includes lots of elements to it that can be and could and would and should be delivered by people who are not therapists. For example, like Peter Levine's work, where there's TRIM and there's CRIM, and that the model is designed to help build resources and bring people through a process. All of that, mindfulness practice of all kinds, and by the way, one can get trained in mindfulness, and mindfulness that is trauma-informed and pointed towards these kind of efforts. People can do that with or without degrees, but the first two phases of EMDR therapy and the ongoing structure of it, the reason why I wanted to bring EMDR therapy into treatment settings, right? In the past, people were like, you can't do it in treatment, it's too early. And it's totally backwards.
Or
right?
dual diagnosis as well, or things like that.
Can't touch the trauma, can't touch the other diagnosis. It's now 2022 and we got to do it differently, right? And it's actually, there's more containment, there's more structure, there's more resources, there's more ongoing support for a person to go through that kind of work when they're in treatment. So, how do we take the best of everything? When I've presented at EMDR conferences around EMDR as a complete psychotherapy, I'm finishing up a journal article on it right now. It looks at name a modality, name an intervention, name a resourcing tool or technique, and I'll be hard pressed to say that can't fit, right? That won't help. And so many of those tools, techniques, modalities, interventions are delivered by non-therapists, right? So you're coming back to your question, which is, it takes a village. And if everyone in the village is trained in the basics of what it means to do things in a trauma-informed way, then someone's going to do it in a not trauma-informed way, and it's going to, glitch the system, right? Gabor Mate is someone else who, besides Van der Kolk, who talks about this a lot. Is that look at the world, look at how it's doing. Look at how much trauma there is. Look at how intergenerational trauma has brought us to where we are. Where's the where's the change? How do we shift that? How do we have a different outcome? And I think we're hey there. I think we're in a spot where we can create a better future for this one, right? Through treating the systemic and the individual and the collective trauma that is our, I was going to say it's our birthright, which is not what it is, which is that's our mission, I think, at this point as a species.
Yeah, apologies for the interruption there from my little Luke, who was out for the afternoon and got an ice pop. But in a way, trauma sadly is our birthright, because it's been there since the dawn of man, and we can't avoid the natural disasters to some degree, or the violence and aggression that can be part of the human experience. But I suppose what we don't understand is that, again, the relational dimension is such a key thing in healing, and that where people have no one, that's the worst part of it. All these things can happen, and if you've someone, well, you can maybe make sense of it and get through it. But if you're on your own with your suffering, that it's more challenging. again. Just on traumatic reenactment, can that play out in the EMDR session, or maybe not so much as in other types of therapy?
So one of the differences between EMDR therapy and some other therapy, for instance, exposure or trauma-focused CBT even, though the design there is for the person to re-experience and to do homework around that re-experiencing and all of that. And with EMDR therapy, the goal is to create enough resource and resilience and ability to tolerate, like increase the affective window of tolerance, so that when we do activate the individual trauma or traumatic event that we're going to work on that day, it's a very quick activation followed by, rapid enough desensitization. Right. And so and that's the mindfulness piece. And that's part of the dual attention and bilateral piece, is that I'm keeping one foot in the present. If I'm going with one foot past, I'm not trying to bring the person back there. I'm treating them in the state that they're in and the difficulty that they're in now because of what happened then. And so we're not, but people can kind of find themselves back there, but again, we've set it up, and that's where the relationship comes in, and the fact that there's a person there to hold the space. If the person does get flooded or, all of that, there's a way for them to kind of get back into the present, with the guidance of the therapist.
Thanks, Steve. And just the very final question, because I'm so conscious of your time. What do you think politicians and policymakers can do to, I suppose, bolster the chances of all children of having a safe, happy, connected childhood and be capable of having good relationships into the future?
So one of the major focuses, or one of my top learning points of the last 3 years of being in the Masters of Healthcare Innovation program at the University of Pennsylvania, has been how to work with policy and policymakers. How do big changes happen? How do big changes get stopped? What are the ways? And so much of it has to be about an acceptance of the dire nature of things. When I say that, I mean like have hope, but to accept how pervasive the role of trauma is, and then how much we need to educate ourselves and then make our policy interventions match the job at hand. And one of the ways I can think about it too, I was just rereading, President Biden in his State of the Union here, made mental health a huge piece of his, of his address. And I was rereading, and there's some parts of it that are like, oh, look, there's that number, 700 million or whatever it is, right? And then there's these vague, the vague ones. And so what needs to happen is that policymakers need to work closely with folks in my profession and the related professions to find the answers, not just for increasing access to mental health care and providing meaningful mental health care that addresses the whole person, but also to address the social determinants of health in a fashion that, that goes to the source of it and then works back and treats social determinants of health and everything else, the violence and the isms, from this perspective. So I feel like that's what's going to give kids, and also not for nothing, sustainability and climate change as it relates to all of it, and vice versa.
Sure.
Right. So some kind of trauma-informed training
for everyone.
For everyone, the
policymakers anyway,
and everybody else.
Yeah, I agree. Sounds great. they might check some of their own responses more, or be curious about, why am I responding that way to this or that, or this small provocation, why this disproportionate response. But Steve, it's been tremendous talking to you. I've so enjoyed it. Thanks for sharing your time and your insights and experience with me. I've really loved it.
Thank you, Jane. And I'll do it anytime.
Super. So folks, this has been Law and Justice with me, Jane Mulcahy, and Dr. Stephen Dansiger on Relationships Matter. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.